Picture this. It is 1945. Britain has just helped save the world from fascism. The Union Jack still flies over a quarter of the planet. The Royal Navy dominates the oceans. British culture, British law, British institutions stretch from Hong Kong to Jamaica to India. By every measure that mattered for centuries, Britain is still a global superpower. And then, quietly, behind closed doors, in a series of meetings that most people have never heard of, it all begins to unravel. Not because of a military defeat, not because of a revolution, but because of a financial agreement signed between two allies who were supposed to be friends. What happened next would reshape the entire world order, and almost nobody talks about it. Welcome back. Today we are pulling back the curtain on one of the most consequential secret deals in modern history. The agreement between Britain and America did not just weaken the British Empire. It systematically dismantled it, transferred its power across the Atlantic, and left Britain financially crippled for decades. This is the story of how an ally became a creditor, how a creditor became a master, and how an entire empire was quietly sold out without a single shot being fired. To understand what happened, you have to go back to before the United States even entered World War II. Britain was already bleeding. By 1940, Churchill knew Britain could not survive the war alone. The country was burning through its gold reserves and foreign assets at a terrifying rate. Every tank, every aircraft, every bullet had to be paid for, and Britain simply did not have enough money. So Roosevelt offered what seemed like a lifeline: Lend-Lease. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. The United States would supply Britain with the weapons and materials it needed to fight, and repayment terms would be worked out later. No immediate cash required. Britain could breathe again. What Churchill called the most unsorted act in history. But here's where the story gets complicated, because nothing in geopolitics is ever truly free. While Lend-Lease was keeping Britain alive, American officials were already thinking several moves ahead. The United States had watched the British Empire control global trade for over a century through something called imperial preference, a system where Britain and its colonies gave each other favorable trading terms and effectively locked American goods out of huge portions of the global market. Washington had resented this for years, and now, with Britain desperate and dependent, America saw its opening. The price of Lend-Lease, buried in the fine print of the agreements being negotiated, would be Britain's agreement to dismantle exactly that system. Britain, in exchange for survival, would have to open its empire's markets to American goods. Think about what that actually means. Britain traded the economic architecture of its entire empire for the right to keep fighting. The empire's preferential trading network, built over generations, was essentially signed away before the war was even won, and most British citizens had absolutely no idea this was happening. But the betrayal, if we can call it that, was only getting started. When the war finally ended in 1945, you might expect that America would give its exhausted allies some breathing room. Instead, Lend-Lease was cut off almost overnight. The moment Japan surrendered, the lifeline was severed. Britain was left standing in the rubble of a war it had helped win, with empty coffers and a destroyed economy, suddenly owing enormous debts and receiving no more American supplies. The country was genuinely on the edge of economic collapse. So Britain went back to Washington with its hand out. And in late 1945, a new negotiation began. Britain needed a loan. Desperately. What emerged from those talks was the Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1946. On the surface, it looked straightforward. America would lend Britain $3.75 billion. Huge money for the time. But attached to that loan were conditions that would prove absolutely catastrophic. The most critical condition was this: Within 1 year of the loan being activated, Britain had to make the pound sterling freely convertible. That meant anyone holding British pounds could exchange them for American dollars on demand. It sounds technical. It was catastrophic. Here's why. After the war, countries around the world, especially those in the British Empire and Commonwealth, were holding enormous quantities of sterling. They had accumulated these reserves during the war, providing goods and services to Britain's war effort. The moment convertibility kicked in, every one of those holders could dump their pounds and grab dollars instead. And that is almost exactly what happened. Within weeks of convertibility being activated in the summer of 1947, the run on sterling became a stampede. Billions drained away almost overnight. Britain had to suspend convertibility after just 37 days. The pound never fully recovered its pre-war authority. Now the deeper pattern becomes visible. This was not purely accidental. American policymakers understood that the British pound, being the world's dominant reserve currency, was a direct competitor to the dollar. If the pound collapsed as a reserve currency, the dollar would fill the vacuum. That is precisely what happened over the following years. The Bretton Woods system, which America had architected in 1944, placed the dollar at the center of global finance. Gold was pegged to the dollar. Every other currency was pegged to the dollar. The pound, the currency that had once defined global commerce, was slowly relegated to second-tier status. America had not just replaced Britain as the world's leading power, it had engineered that replacement using financial instruments rather than military force. That is genuinely extraordinary when you sit with it. And the dismantling did not stop with finance. The convertibility crisis weakened Britain so severely that it accelerated the collapse of the empire itself. India became independent in 1947, the same year as the sterling crisis. Palestine was abandoned. The Greek and Turkish commitments Britain had maintained were handed off to America under the Truman Doctrine, again in 1947. Historians sometimes call 1947 the year Britain finally admitted it could no longer run a global empire. That year was not a coincidence. It was the direct consequence of the financial terms Britain had accepted. There is one more episode that drives this point home harder than anything else. Suez, 1956. Britain, frustrated with Egyptian President Nasser nationalizing the Suez Canal, joined France and Israel in a military operation to take it back. For a brief moment, it looked like Britain was asserting old-fashioned imperial power, and then Washington made a phone call. Eisenhower told Britain in no uncertain terms to stand down. He threatened to withhold support for the pound on international currency markets, and that would trigger a financial catastrophe Britain could not survive. Britain withdrew, humiliated, in front of the entire world. The military power of the old empire meant nothing when America held the financial lever. Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned shortly after. The Suez Crisis is often cited as the definitive end of Britain's status as a great power. But what it really demonstrated was that the mechanism for that ending had been built a decade earlier, in those loan agreements and currency negotiations that most people never read. So what do we make of all this? Was it a betrayal? Was it simply ruthless but rational statecraft? The answer is probably both, depending on where you stand. American officials would argue, and have argued, that they were not obligated to simply prop up a British empire that excluded American trade and maintained systems of colonial extraction. From Washington's perspective, the post-war order they were building centered on free trade, international institutions, and dollar dominance was genuinely better for global prosperity than British imperial preference had been, and there is an argument to be made for that view. But from Britain's perspective, and from the perspective of the empire's many subjects who had fought and died in that war, the speed and ruthlessness with which American financial power was deployed against an exhausted ally was startling. Britain did not lose its empire on a battlefield. It lost it in a negotiating room while desperately trying to pay its bills. The men doing the negotiating on the British side knew the terms were bad. John Maynard Keynes, perhaps the most brilliant economist of the 20th century, led the British delegation in Washington in 1945. He privately considered the American terms extremely harsh. He negotiated as hard as he could, and he still came home with a deal that ultimately accelerated Britain's imperial decline. When even Keynes could not save you at the negotiating table, you understand the depth of the power imbalance that existed. The really unsettling truth is this: empires do not always fall because of armies or revolutions. Sometimes they fall because of spreadsheets and interest rates and currency convertibility clauses buried in loan agreements. The British Empire, which once commanded the greatest naval force in history and governed hundreds of millions of people across 6 continents, was fundamentally undone by financial architecture, by dollar diplomacy, by an ally who recognized that the most powerful weapon in the modern world was not a battleship or a bomb. It was control of the global monetary system. Next time you look at a dollar bill, remember that the currency in your hand was not just printed, it was engineered to dominate. And the story of how it got there runs directly through Britain's most desperate hour, and a deal that was far less friendly than either side ever publicly admitted. If this kind of hidden history is what you are here for, there's a lot more where this came from. Stay with us.